everybody. Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me as always, well, one of you is with me and one of you still virtual. Who's here in person?
It's me, Diana.
Jackie.
What?
Wouldn't that be a funny twist? Diana and I are still friends, but I am now living with Rob.
We swapped locations.
No,
We're
I'm
doing
here
Wife
with you
Swap,
in
the show.
studio. It's me, Diana.
And I'm at my home.
Jackie can't
And
be
me,
bothered.
Jackie.
Can't be bothered to come over and podcast with us anymore. I don't remember why. There was a reason at one point. Sure, it's gone now.
It's
When you're hearing this,
so-
Maybe we're not friends.
we all broke up.
No, we didn't.
No.
I think wife swapping would be funny.
When you say wife swapping and not in the context of a television show, it sounds creepy.
Oh, yeah. I'm talking about in the context of the television show where you learn the lives and then you like make your own rules and then you come back around and you like appreciate your wife more on TNT.
I thought the point of that show is that you were supposed to learn as a wife that your rules don't apply to all other settings. No, it was for the husbands and the children to appreciate.
It was all about the families to appreciate their wife.
Well, it's about culture. Well, how every family has their own culture.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
How some are just wrong and some are right.
No, but you don't think
That's not the
about
lesson?
the aspects of your culture being specific to you, but other people don't necessarily do things the way you do.
Right.
And that's okay.
Right. And thinking about different perspectives.
What?
Whoa.
You know,
Mhm.
taking the perspective of others in their own lives.
It's not always easy to do that.
Mm-mm.
Sometimes you have to be taught how.
Before we go on too long about how hit reality shows about wife swapping relate to this week's topic, why don't we say what the show is? We're a show about behavior analysis and behavior analytic research. Every week we pick a topic in the field and we discuss relevant research articles. And as you probably could hint, this week we're talking all about perspective taking, the skill.
Ooh.
Is it a mind file skill, Jackie, or is it a behavior? You know, who knows? We do.
I think
We
we'll
read the
have
research.
to delve in. I think we're going to have to delve in and
We'll have to
see.
delve in. Yes,
Does that
so
work?
Do it.
delve in?
Yeah, is that what
No,
people
you got
say?
it.
You can delve in, can't you?
You just gave yourself a self 5.
Oh,
Self
all right. Man, we're so far off track. I can't take your perspective when you're not here, Jackie. It's too hard. I'm
I know.
confused.
Sorry.
In any case, perspective taking. So this week we're going to talk all about perspective taking. We have 3 articles we will be discussing. Shall I share them?
Yes.
Yes, I shall. All right. The first is Teaching Children with Autism, a Basic Component Skill of Perspective Taking by Gould, Tarbox, O'Hora, Noon, and Bergstrom from Behavioral Interventions 2011. We then move on to some more recent articles, including Teaching a Perspective-Taking Component Skill to Children with Autism in the Natural Environment by Welsh, Najdowski, Strauss, Gallegos, and Fullen from JABA 2019, and Teaching Social Perception Skills to Adolescents with Autism and Intellectual Disabilities using Video-Based Group Instruction by Stauch, Plavnick, Sankar, and Gallagher, also from JABA in 2018.
All right.
Yep. So when we talk about perspective taking, I think most of us think, theory of mind. We think back to our undergrad psychology courses, and we sort of have that, I guess it must have had something to do with your brain and how your brain is perceiving things. But then, we all went to grad school and learned about behavior and learned that talking about things in terms of cognitive discussion is a lot of circular logic many times. So we try to think of everything in terms of human behavior. So why don't we start by discussing sort of just generally what perspective taking is, talk a little bit about it in the cognitive lens, and then go into how we could reframe everything in perspective taking as human behavior. And Danny, why don't you start us off with that?
Sure. So, well, first of all, I don't think I had heard this term before entering into the behavior analytic realm, but maybe I just wasn't taking the right classes in college. I'm not super sure. So the term perspective taking for me didn't really have a lot of background outside of learning about it as something that we should, assess for and then teach in the context of teaching individuals with autism or intellectual disabilities. As it is a behavior that we can measure, and it's actually really an umbrella term that includes a lot of different types of social behavior that are often quite complex. And the developmental literature certainly was looking at this far before the behavior analytic literature was. So the perspective taking term is one that we've kind of modified from the developmental literature. And the earlier stuff that you'll see is usually talking about theory of mind. And that's the term that you said you'd heard before.
Yes.
Yeah. That's a type of term where you're like, what does that even mean? And still today, I'm like, I don't know.
It's like gravity.
Theory of mind. I mean,
it's the theory of gravity and the theory of mind.
What are we even trying to talk about here? But one of the interesting things when you talk about theory of mind, well, first of all, I guess I should say, the idea here is that you need to understand what someone else is thinking, right? In order to adequately respond in a social context to them. And
well, you don't have to do that if you don't want to. However, there are going to be consequences for failing to engage in perspective taking.
Make that sound very punitive. There are going to be some social consequences if you
there will be social consequences.
If you guess wrong or you don't know how someone's feeling, then you might not say the right thing at the right time, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's what we mean when we say theory of mind, is being able to take the perspective of someone else based on some types of nonverbal signs, often, or contextual clues, which are then going to give you the opportunity to inference what their covert thoughts or feelings might be, and then you can respond accordingly. So that's kind of where we're coming from when we say theory of mind. And something that, you guys might know, but other people may not know, is that the guy that does a lot of this theory of mind research is Simon Baron-Cohen, and he is in fact Sacha Baron Cohen's cousin.
Oh, yes.
I noticed that on Wikipedia once. I was like, they have the same last name, and I was like, oh, whoa!
Yeah. So if anyone out there doesn't know, Sacha Baron Cohen is the guy that does Borat. They're both very talented in their respective fields, right? So Simon Baron Cohen is a fairly famous.
I thought Simon Baron Cohen's movie about pretending to be a character, making fun of, stereotypes or pointing out stereotypes, it was just not as much funny. It's just not as funny as his brothers. I don't know. I'm sorry. Too much research.
But he didn't do that.
No, he did. I know he didn't do that.
He did make these videos for kids they were supposed to look like Thomas the Train, but they had different emotive faces on the trains in an effort to try to teach kids about emotions. Because I think he was like, well, everyone loves Thomas the Train, so let's adapt that and try to have it teach them things. So that series was out there for a while. I'm not sure if it's still around or not.
Cool.
Yeah, but he's a very, very well-respected researcher. So the theory of mind stuff is usually coming from him and the developmental camp. I will just add in here, there's a book that I really like that I've often used to work on teaching perspective taking that was written by him called Teaching Children with Autism to Mind Read. It's a 2-parter, and the one I usually used was the green cover one, which might have been part 2. But it had really nice little scenarios in it. It had, different sections of it. Some of it had faces with no mouth and little cartoony faces, and you had to indicate which direction the mouth should be turned, up or down, depending on the situation that was presented. And so those were the simpler examples, and they had more complex ones in which they might have a whole scene, and it might, the one I'm thinking of has no face on the cartoon, but the ice cream cone and the ice cream is down on the ground, right? So you had to say, well, how does this person feel in this scenario? And also, what might they do next, right? So building upon what the emotions are and then starting to inference what other things might need to happen based on that. So it's a great series of books for young kids. But the idea there is that it's sometimes quite difficult to tell how someone else might be feeling in a situation. And the kernel of that is that not everyone feels the way that you do, right? And for very young children, this can be beyond their understanding. So even for children without social, neurodifference, perspective taking in the way that we think of it doesn't usually come into play until kids are 4, 5, sometimes even 6 years old. So it's a pretty complex idea, the idea that someone else doesn't think and feel the same exact things that you think and feel at that point in time. And then building on that we need to use context clues basically to figure out how someone else is feeling and then respond. We might need to respond in different ways depending on how they're feeling, which is all pretty complicated stuff there. So the episode that we did on empathy back on episode number 53 touches on perspective taking. That fits into this category as well. And there's a fair amount of behavior analytic research that's targeted some of the sub-skills within the area of perspective taking. It's a pretty big area, honestly.
So I don't think we have made it explicit. It sort of was hinted at, and then we also mentioned it because it was in pretty much all the journal articles. But what we're focusing on tonight is not just the idea of perspective taking and how does it develop, but we're focusing on training related to perspective taking for individuals with autism. Because one of the challenges of the diagnosis of autism is that often perspective taking skills don't develop at the same speed or to the same quality as they do to neurotypical peers. So while neurotypical children usually develop perspective taking around 5, maybe 6, maybe a little bit earlier even. Children with ASD often don't develop that skill, even way past that without explicit instruction, which is thought to be one of the main reasons that social interactions or social skills can really suffer. Because if you're not able to, or if it's hard for you to pay attention to the perspective of another individual or interpreting them, then you're going to have a very different social response than one would expect. And certainly one of the things we've, learned about social skills is when you get a response that you're not expecting, it's often kind of punishing to continue having a social interaction with that other individual. We've seen this a lot in some of our research articles we've discussed on social skills in college or dealing with, you joining in conversation skills. And this may come down to the same deficits in perspective taking that we're going to be talking about tonight.
Yeah. So Allen, Baron-Cohen, and Hadwin, 1999, did a really nice job of summarizing what they laid out as 5 different levels of perspective taking. And I think that can be helpful in thinking about how one might structure a perspective taking curriculum series from sort of easier skills to potentially teach to more complex skills. So the way that they laid it out is kind of how we're going to talk through the articles that we have to present tonight too. So the first level, as they presented it, was simple visual perspective taking. So can I see what someone else sees, like just visually see in their visual field, or do we have different fields of vision? And then complex visual perspective taking. So like an item can look different from different points of view. So for example, if you have like a cube and you might see one side of it, but someone else might see another side of it. I'm really bad at those. Like when they
rotate in space kind of.
Oh my God, I'm so not spatial in that way. But yeah, so that type of skill can be difficult. And then the third level they talk about is the idea of seeing leads to knowing. So, which is again, like a little frou-frou, right? But each of us is experiencing all of our 5 senses at the same time, but the way that we're experiencing them or what precisely we're experiencing is different from what someone else might be experiencing. And then from there, they move into this, more complex view of social perception, and someone else might be feeling something different than us, and they may be coming into a situation with different background knowledge and history than us, and therefore would respond differently in a situation than we would. And that's where you bring in the false belief task, which is traditionally called the Sally Ann test. In the Sally Ann test, if you guys aren't familiar with it, I'll go through it really quick. So you have a child there with 2 little dolls. The dolls, there's a box and I don't remember, a basket. That's what it is. And so you have the first little doll, Sally, take the ball and put it in the basket. And then Sally leaves the scene, so she's gone. Then Anne comes and takes the ball out of the basket and puts it into the box. And then they bring Sally back. And you ask the child, where is Sally going to look for the ball? Now, you and I are grown-ups. We've probably established perspective taking in our repertoire. So we are going to say, Sally will look for the ball in the first location, which was the basket, right? Because when she left the room, that's where the ball was. So she has no reason to think that it's not there. But young children that don't have this perspective taking skill will say, Sally will look for the ball in the box, because they know that the ball is now in the box. So they don't have the perspective that Sally was gone when the ball was moved from the basket to the box, right? So you can see how complex that really is. And that's even a simple example compared to some of the types of applications of perspective taking when we bring in emotion and history, etc., right? But that's the type of skill when we're saying that perspective taking doesn't really emerge until ages 5 or 6. It's in reference to those like fairly complex false belief / Sally Ann type of tests, which are the higher level of the perspective taking curriculum.
Mm.
Do you remember when you did this with your kids?
Yeah.
Around that episode, you tested perspective taken with your middle child.
Yeah.
And your cousins.
Or I think he was 5, and then the oldest one was 9. So the oldest one could do it, but the 5-year-old could not. So I think if we have time, I'm going to try it again now that the middle one is 8 and the little one is 4. And I'm going to see what happens.
I'll try it with mine too.
Okay.
We'll get back to you guys in our next preview episode.
Yeah, exactly. Sounds good. So we should probably move on to talk about the articles, but suffice it to say that perspective taking is a complex skill that requires one to be able to tackle your own private events, as well as make analyses about the environmental stimuli and nonverbal behavior of someone else, being able to tact those events, and then make discriminations on the options to respond and then act accordingly with reference to all of those environmental stimuli. So it can be quite complex, but it doesn't mean that it can't be taught as well as operationally defined. And each of the studies that we're going to review tonight does exactly that.
So knowing that we can describe, whatever your field is, you can describe perspective taking in the end as our interactions with the environment. And if we can describe something behaviorally, that means we should be able to provide some sort of intervention behaviorally too. And that's where Jackie's going to be discussing the first article, the Gould 2011 article on teaching a basic component of perspective taking.
Yeah, and so the one component of the prerequisite of perspective taking they were trying to teach was gaze following. And I thought they did it in a very, very clever way. They used a discrete trial format where they used multiple exemplar training in a very controlled setting to demonstrate that they could teach this gaze following in this very controlled setting. And then they looked to see if it would again appear or generalize into the natural environment. And so that's what they did. So they used 3 children diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder. They were aged 3 to 5. And when I saw this, it gave me pause. And maybe it shouldn't have, but it did a little bit because 3 to 5 is where we would typically not see our typically developing children demonstrate perspective taking, but maybe they would do gaze following, right? So maybe they can't the complex forms of perspective taking, but gaze following they should be able to do at that point. So at first I was like, hey, wait. But then after thinking about it, it doesn't seem that far off. And
could have been preemptive training too. The idea of like, well, we don't know if this is going to work, or maybe you have a sense it might work from a pilot study we did. And, if we're going to be teaching the skill, well, we want it to be at a level of mastery by the time they are 5 so that the children are sort of back on the expected developmental trajectory of their peers. So that could have been it too. It doesn't say in the article.
It doesn't say, no, but that was I was like reading, stop, hey! And I wonder if that's what our readers will find too, because we talk about it not coming until typically 5, but we're working with children that are younger than 5. So all of the children were receiving EIBI between 11 and 18 months of 1-to-1 ABA support in their homes. For the most part, they needed a variety of prerequisites to be part of the study. They had to sit at the table. They had to discriminate and tack the pictures that were going to be used. This is a clever one, respond to visual prompts. So the visual prompt was an arrow. So that's like very specific, right? So that's one thing that if you don't have that, it might not be as effective, this procedure. But none of them had experience with theory of mind or perspective taking in their general teaching objectives, so that makes sense. One thing I do love is that they ran it during their regular therapy sessions with their typical therapist. So this wasn't like a novel experimenter coming in. The therapists were trained to run the assessment, and then they just ran it as they normally would. And I think that's interesting. So they had 24 stimulus cards that were created, and each of the stimulus cards, there was a person that just showed head and shoulders in the middle. And then there was various pictures around the head. So to the left, to the right, to the top. And it was interesting that the person only looked right and left. Up and down served as distractors. And in baseline and probes, there was no arrow present. So arrow served as the prompt. But in the training sessions, there was an arrow included. And the arrow goes from the eyes to the picture and then fades back, which I think is pretty clever. So you should read this article just to look at the stimulus cards because they're very
It looks
fun.
like a Sesame Street design. It's like, boop, 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 boop. There's the arrow, the dotted line going right to the dog. Boop, boop, boop,
Right?
boop, boop.
And the guy has some killer sideburns.
He sure does. Yep. And so they were measured what, after following the prompt, what did he or she see? So the participant was required to name the picture the person was looking at across the various multiple exemplars. So that was their primary dependent variable. And then once they acquired that skill, they went into the natural environment and conducted a probe with a real person. I like that they called it in a real person in this 3D. And the participant, after saying the prompt, what did he or she see, they had to name what they could theoretically see in the environment, right? So there wasn't a specific thing that they needed to tact. It just had to be some in the line of vision in the environment.
Yeah. And when I've run this before in real life, even if you are like looking at something particular, if it's far away, the other person isn't, it's not that precise, right?
Right.
Following someone's gaze shift. So they could be looking near that thing. And if they pick anything in that general vicinity, then it's correct.
Right. So they utilized a concurrent multiple probe design across participants. During baseline, they had the 24 trials for each stimulus card. They provided no prompting or feedback, and they interspersed a master trial between 3 experimental trials to just improve attending overall during the session. They ran baseline sessions 2 times per week on 9 randomly selected trials. During training, they had 8 to 12 trials. The visual prompt was the arrow, and they used a most to least fading of prompts for the arrows from the eyes to the object. So it was like a long arrow. It got a little shorter. It got a little shorter, and then the arrow was gone, which is kind of cool, right? Yeah. 4 stimulus cards were trained concurrently concurrently, right? That means at the same time. I was going to write that. Concurrently at the same time. And so that's where you get that multiple exemplar training in, right? So once mastery criteria was met, then they did a generalization probe on an untrained card as well as a trained card. So they just picked a card and then plopped it down. But they only took data on the generalization probe. So any card could have been presented multiple times, but then they only took data on the generalization card, the untrained card. Once participants reached 80% criteria, then they moved into the natural environment probe, right, where they're in the natural environment. Only 1 participant had an error correction procedure. That was Hannah, because the visual arrow alone was not enough to increase responding. So they included a no, try again if she was incorrect, and then they provided hand-over-hand guidance to follow the arrow. And then the next trial was initiated. During the generalization and natural environment probe, no feedback or prompting was given there. And I do love in the natural environment probe, they made sure that the second person was a familiar person in a familiar environment with familiar things so that they knew that they could like tact where they were. And yeah, so they did the final probe 2 to 3 weeks post-final training for 2 of the participants. 1 of the participants, Hannah, was not available for that final probe. And so
too busy.
She's so busy. She was not right now in a lockdown situation.
Maybe they were on vacay.
Yeah.
Right. But yeah, and then they did do a maintenance probe where they did 12 trials of randomly selected exemplars at the end of the study for 2 of the participants. And they rocked it. Really, they did. So we're at the results now. We bustled through those methods.
You just cut through those like with a machete. It's like, wah, wah, wah. We're here at the results. You're our jungle guide.
Thank you. I'm Perspective Taken Jungle Guide. PTJ. G. That's my acronym. So during baseline, there was low performance for all participants. With 1 participant, Aaron, you saw a rapid increase in performance, but a dip in responding each time the prompt was faded, which makes sense, right? He had to get into the groove a little bit. Initially, he did not generalize. We did not see responding generalized to those untrained cards, but then they did, and that was great. And so it was high during generalization, and then he responded around 40% during his natural environment probe, and it was at 0 initially, so, it's not all the way up, but it's better. For the other participant, he only required 4 sessions during training, which is like phenomenal, so quick. And during his natural environment probe, he responded around 66% of the time correct. And he had 0 at baseline as well. And his last natural environment probe was around 62%. So from 0 to 62%, that's pretty great. And then Hannah did not demonstrate a consistent change until that error correction procedure was implemented. And she responded around 81% of the time during her generalization probes. And her first natural environment probe, she scored around 44% correctly. So again, it's pretty interesting, right? Those results. We saw really rapid learning for 2 participants, and they demonstrated maintenance of the skill following 3 weeks on the specific, conditional discrimination, multiple exemplar 2D cards. They didn't see a ton. Like, they weren't like, whoa, and then we taught it. They can do it in the real life, right? Because they did good, but they didn't do great, right? 66% 44% are good, but they're not great. And so they said that this is potentially because it went from a 2D to a 3D, right? It's like very structured to less structure. There's lots of distractions in the real environment, the natural environment, that weren't present in the 2D little card. And they said that you had to look at the whole person rather just the head and the shoulders. What would be really fascinating is that when I was reading this, I was thinking, wouldn't it be funny if like you brought like a big, huge piece of cardboard and you just covered your body and then you could only see the head and shoulders?
And maybe you would have gotten better generalization if that were the case.
Right, maybe.
Proscenium in front of you.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me that they had challenges with generalization, considering how different their training environment and task was from the natural environment. I see how this relates to perspective taking, but it's also like, I feel like it's a pre-perspective taking kind of skill. And
even developmentally, it was that skill number one.
Yes.
Do you see what I see?
You need to know where the other person's looking. So then later on, you can figure out that if they're looking in a different place than you are, that you can't see what they see and they can't see what you see.
Yeah. And that seems to be kind of a theme in previous research. So research prior to this 2011 study is that it is possible to use the behavioral technology or other interventions to teach the sort of what we think of as a prerequisite to perspective taking. However, the results often look like these results. In that, look, I can teach this one component, this very specific skill, and then nothing comes of it, you know? Right. And then in the real world, nobody cared because it didn't really change the overall behavior of perspective taking. Mm-hmm. So there's always that question of, are we just, is perspective taking prerequisite teaching, here's the party trick, but it doesn't actually teach you anything meaningful. Right. Or is this not going to generalize in a meaningful way?
We run into this a lot in joint attention research as well. And I've also taught this particular skill, in fact, in the context of joint attention responding to a gaze shift. So it's the type of behavior that could be viewed as being part of multiple response classes. But the question is always, am I teaching form or am I teaching function, right? So what is the function of these, nuts and bolts of joint attention or nuts and bolts of perspective taking? And if we teach them, piece by piece, are they actually going to add up to what the function of perspective taking is or the function of joint attention is? And sometimes the answer is yes, but often I think the answer probably is we didn't really create the sum of the parts.
Right.
Well, fortunately for us, we've got some more research to discuss, and some of the results may end up being a little bit better. But let's take a quick break first, and then we'll come right back with more on perspective taking. We'll be right back.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD-level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu.
See you there!
And we are back talking all about perspective taking. But I'm going to see if I can do some perspective taking now. Some of you might be wondering, hey, where are my secret code words? And some of you might say, why would I need to know secret code words? Well, I'll tell you why. Because ABA Inside Track is ACE approved. By listening to our episodes, you are able to earn 1 learning type credit. All you need to do is, finish listening to the show and then go to our website, abainsidetrack.com/get-CEUs, and enter in 2 secret code words that we've hidden in the episode. We're going to read you the first one right now, and it is foyer.
Ooh.
Or some of you might say foyer. Some of you might say it that way.
Not me. I say foyer.
Yeah, most of you will say it foyer because you're fancy.
Most people. How do you know?
I'm assuming.
I say foyer.
What does that say about you, Diana?
I don't have one of those, so I never say it.
It's like the front area of your house, or our
I know, I don't have one.
No, I know. I'm telling it to the audience.
Oh.
You didn't take the perspective of the audience there, Jay. They might not
true,
know.
I did not.
But in any case, it would be spelled F-O-Y.
I also call it the icebox.
I got to spell it out. You're interrupting me. F-O-Y-E-R. So it doesn't matter how you pronounce it. Just spell it right. And that's all that really matters.
I like to wear tennis shoes.
Huh?
Tennis shoes.
She's just going for it.
I don't even know what you're talking about now.
I do. She's just saying.
I call them tennis shoes.
Look at my face. It's super confused. Therefore, your joke's not landing. So sorry. Foyer. All right, my turn to talk. My turn to talk about research. Yay. So in the intervening years after Gould, there was an extension by Haas in 2015, which, again, I think he asked the question, why not look up and down on your cards? And so the extension and replication were, let's add up and down on the cards. And again, able to teach the skill. What do I see? Looking up, looking down, looking left, looking right. Similar issues, though, in that only one of the participants then generalized that skill to a live probe, to the natural environment. So, okay, is this a dead end in terms of teaching a skill? No,
it's not.
It's not. No, it was a rhetorical question. So, is promising beginning? Is it going to lead us where we need to go? And so now we're going to get into the Welsh 2019 study. So most of the time when I think we do a lot of research on perspective taking, we're talking about what do people see. But much of what we do when we do perspective taking has to do with our other senses. Feel, hear, smell, taste to some extent. I was reading this and I was like, when does it happen into play? But then just later on, Diana opens the refrigerator door and makes one of those faces like, ugh. And, I have to know that's not my cue to go over and be like, Diana, have a snack. She's probably not in the mood. Something gross has hit her nostrils or hit her tongue. And she probably would prefer me saying something like, oh no, what's wrong? What smells bad? Or what tastes bad? Or should I clean the fridge? So what are our other senses? And can we teach a similar skill to what do I see with our other four senses? Then the bigger question that was also asked, I thought the bigger question in this study was, and then what if we did this rather than with flashcards with arrows? What if we did this in real life? So all of the training occurred with three-dimensional individuals and objects in the environment. Would we see better generalization to real life? Which, that was my question reading the 2011 article, but you got to start somewhere. And your flashcards, it's a great way to get started.
I thought it was ingenious, actually. Mm-hmm. When I looked at those stimulus cards, I was like, that is ingenious, right? You can really control the environment. And now I love that they've done something to move us forward.
Yeah.
That's what research should do. Woo!
You start small and you build from there. And this also answers your other question, Jackie, in that the participants were older children, so 4 to 8-year-old children with ASD diagnosis. They all had level 3 VB-MAP skills, which I think is important, though the Haas 2015 study did teach the what do you see skill with children who had less of a verbal repertoire than in the original 2011 study. So it's not as if you could not teach this skill to children who might not have that advanced of verbal repertoire. But I think it's good to know that that was the cohort being trained in this study. Right. They were able to tackle all the stimuli in the experiment. They could respond to questions with pronouns. They could respond to questions with the names of familiar people. They were able to tact items by sense. So I think for this study, it was important because who knows if the same type of intervention is going to work for senses when it comes to feeling and hearing and smelling. It is really, I can now think of my 5 senses very easily. It's like see, and
hear.
There's 4 others.
Taste, touch, smell.
Yes, thank you.
Oh, yeah. Touch. That's what you missed, Rob.
I was missed touch. So this study was done in a non-concurrent multiple baseline. You have your 3 participants. And pretty much what they were training was looking at another individual. Can they label a stimulus that they're interacting with and then answer the question, what can he or she see or taste or feel or hear or smell? One at a time. They didn't put the slash in between. I'm just doing that to save time. So similarly to the first study, these were all conducted in the participants' homes in a variety of rooms with both 2 people from the family as well as 2 of the experimenters. And then in the training, it was only the experimenter who would be involved. And they always had multiple people in the room, so there were other distractors as well. So the children really did have to be paying attention and discriminating who the question was being asked about and what the individual was doing. So there were 10 trials in which, I love this, it was like, it felt like a Dungeons and Dragons game where you got like a table of monsters and you got to roll your dice and see which monster is going to jump out at you. Except in this case, it was which individual is going to be demonstrating which sense in the environment. Sometimes it was the goblin eating mutton. Sometimes it was like mom or dad smelling, a candle or eating a candy or something, something along those lines. They would just have to sort of look over at the individual. The experimenters were very clear to the person. They kind of, I don't know if they whispered to them and said, okay, you're going to be tasting something. And the individual would only start doing the taste. They sort of pantomime the taste, or they'd actually eat the thing. They wouldn't pantomime. When the child was not also trying to eat something, because they really wanted to control for the, is the student just labeling what they're currently doing rather than what someone else is doing? So they had all these kind of checks and balances of you only look at the thing when the child is not. You only smell the item when the child is not. I also loved how there were very clear instructions about if you're smelling something, you can't also touch it. If you're feeling something, you also have to look away from the thing you're feeling. So they were very clear about you can only engage in one sense at any given time. Touching also, it was very clearly, they had to rub something. It was not like, I'm going to lightly touch. It was like, I'm going to grab an item and I'm going to rub my hands all over it. So there's no mistake. I'm touching and I'm looking up at the ceiling while I do it. I'm eating something, but I'm not looking at what I'm eating. And my hands are holding some other object. Like I have something in my hand and food in my mouth.
And they're like, what is happening? Really what the participant's looking at is being like, I do not know
what's happening in life here. Yeah. So again, a lot of control done to make sure that when you're asking, what are they smelling? The individual was clearly either labeling only that one item or there was a distractor in place. If there was a distractor in place, the experimenters would know and they'd be able to change their intervention. So it probably looked really weird if you're watching it from outside. Like nobody smells like that. Nobody feels like that. That's creepy. So you got all these individuals feeling and smelling and hearing things. Hearing was the only one they sort of were worried about because again, hearing, the student couldn't taste the same thing, or the participant couldn't taste the same thing as the parent or as the experimenter, but hearing was one, whatever the participant heard, it was going to be the same thing that the target person was hearing. So that was the only one they couldn't control for. They didn't put, earplugs in the kids' ears or something like that. So in baseline, it pretty much was just, you roll your die and somebody's going to do one of those sensors or engage in one of those sense behaviors. And then they'd ask a couple of questions about some of the people, ask another couple of questions about another. They'd get 10 questions. What does he, she see, hear, feel, taste, smell, or touch? They then did training. So in the training, again, they had the same setup, except it was only the experimenter near the participant that was engaging in all of these sense-type behaviors. Treatment package had multiple exemplar training. That does seem to be a pretty key component, a pretty common thread in the perspective-taking literature, the perspective-taking training literature. Every trial, there was a brand new stimulus being used. They went through a lot of stimuli. I don't know how they made that table, because if you ask me, name things you can see, I named about 5 things, and then I'm like, I don't know anymore. I got them all. Smell, air, I'm done. I don't have any more. So good for them for even having that table and having all those stimuli ready to go. They then had an error correction procedure that they would use if the child made an error, the participant made an error. And then, of course, they had a reinforcement plan in place. So for correct responses, the student was on the behavior was on a CRF schedule for correct responses. The error procedure, I liked. I'm going to mention real quick. They'd ask a leading question. Are my eyes looking at whatever the wrong thing the child said? Because, what do I see? And they said something wrong, like milk carton, and I was actually looking at my sandwich. They would, are my eyes looking at the milk carton, or are my hands feeling the sandwich or whatever it was? Is my nose close to the? I'm guessing those are the kinds of the questions. You gotta rub that sandwich hard so the kid knows what you're doing. Yeah. And if the participant was able to respond correctly, no, you're not. Then they just ask the question. So, what am I seeing? What am I smelling? If the child got that wrong or continued to get the wrong answer, then they'd move into their second phase of their correction procedure, where they'd bring the child to where the experimenter was, and they'd sort of have them engage in the sense behavior and then ask the question again. If they were still wrong, they'd just say, I smell the sandwich, or I smell the milk, whatever it was. They would just give them the full verbal model. And they started treating just see and taste. Once they got 80% accuracy, or the participant got 80% accuracy, they'd add another sense. They added feel, then hear, then smell. Then they do all 5 senses, random rotation. Then they moved into a novel person probe, where they had somebody else. So it was much more like the baseline in that regard. And they had all these other procedures. I love when you get an article that says, and we had this other procedure and this other procedure just in case, but the kids were great, so we didn't have to bother. And it's like, okay, great. That's awesome. I'm glad you were thinking ahead.
You sound like Diana for this episode.
Because I love the article so much?
Yeah.
And after they finished with the novel probe individual, they faded reinforcement to a VR3 schedule. Then they went into post-training when the participants got 2 consecutive sessions with 80% accuracy or above. And in post-training, it pretty much was the same as baseline, except they didn't use any of the stimuli that had been trained. So any correct responses were completely novel in terms of the sense, so the stimuli being used. It was still smell, hear, all that stuff. It was still the parents and the experimenters being, asked the questions about what is he, she, whatever verb you're using there, but none of the same items. So nothing that had actually been directly trained or presented in training. To start, the results were very similar to the previous research in that the participants really didn't do an amazing job answering the question during baseline, but very quickly with the intervention package, were responding correctly to those questions. What am I smelling? What am I hearing? It took like 3 or 5 trials per participant to move throughout all 5 senses. So it's like 6, I think 5 or 6 was the maximum before they were rotating through all 5 stimuli. Very fast. Then they did great in the novel person probe. I think everybody got it first time. They maintained the responding with accurate responding during the thinning. Then they did post-training. And here's where we got our difference. Here, unlike with the other research, we actually did see generalization for the participants in the natural environment. So when you actually ask, what is mom smelling? You got the correct answer. You got the, oh, mom's smelling the milk. Mom, even with them doing the weird, funny dance where, mom's bending down to smell something and while holding some other object and looking out, at a different thing, you still got the correct answers. I think it was about 80% or above 80% for all 3 participants, which was, finally what we were hoping to see. Typically, baseline errors were things like they just labeled the incorrect object. Sometimes the participants gave these like random responses like, I like this song, which was unrelated. Sometimes the participants didn't really know how to answer, so they just didn't answer. So there wasn't really there was kind of an error pattern in that regard, but it more seemed like a skill that participants just didn't know how to respond. But by the end, they did, and they did it in real life, or at least as close as real life as your sort of experiment home session can be. So we got some good results here, which is great. We finally got that generalization. Was it the fact that they trained in the environment? Was it just, unlike the other studies, they had so many stimuli across sense modalities being trained that just got the skill to click? Was it, hey, these 3 participants were the magic 3 participants that just got the skill compared to the other participants? It's not clear. Probably it's something to do with the multiple exemplars. Probably it's something to do with the generalization. So the practice all occurred. Generalization looked almost exactly like the practice situations or the training situations. But, again, this is a pretty recent article, so I haven't seen any replications or extensions of this exact procedure. So we
probably coming.
Have to see. I hope so.
Probably coming, right? Because this was 2019, so we just read it. And now we're working on it.
Yeah.
Just read it.
So now that we've talked about some of the basic prerequisite skills, we're going to jump all the way ahead to what's the point? That's great. That when mom is sticking her face into the fridge, she's smelling the pickle jar, or, when the experimenter is grabbing a water bottle and, moving their hands all over the place on it, they're feeling the water bottle. We know these things now. Does that actually lead to a change in social skills or social perception? And so to round out the evening, Diana, you're going to present the Stauch article, which jumps way ahead to those more advanced social perception skills.
But back a year in time.
Back in time, but the more advanced skill.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And there, like Rob is saying, there's kind of a lot in the middle here that
who cares? We're just going to the end.
Past. So the gamut of things you could target underneath the umbrella of perspective taking is pretty broad, starting with some of the types of things that you guys were looking at. So just the basics of what is this other person sensing right now? But there's a lot of steps in between, including is what they are experiencing the same or different from what I'm experiencing. And I've had curricula set up in the past where I've taught that type of skill to individuals as well. You can move on from that where, I've done some where I had kids sit like back to back, or the teacher and the student sit back to back and say, I can see the clock. Can you see the clock? And have them need to report yes or no, I can see what you see type of things. And then from there, moving on to doing some version of the false belief task or the Sally Ann test where you actually like go through the process of practicing that with multiple types of little stimuli. Like we would hide something in a box that looked like a crayon box, but inside was a car, right? So then they would have to take it to another teacher and be like, what do you think's in this box? And then make a prediction on whether that the teacher who didn't see you put the car in the crayon box, whether they know it was a car inside or they think it was crayons, right? So like there's a lot of steps in between, but the study that I'm going to do jumps like way to the end of the whole sequence of things that might be targeted underneath the umbrella of perspective taking to look at some more complex social skills for teenagers with autism and intellectual disabilities. And this study in particular was looking at video-based group instruction, which is kind of cool in that it was an extension of how one might provide training for this, but the basics of what they were doing was a perspective taking skill. So the term that they used throughout the study was social perception versus perspective taking, which just allowed them to target a little more broadly some of the types of things that you might be looking at in a social context, but a lot of them do sort of spiral down to being perspective taking skills. But first, I was just going to give you the definition that they did of social perception. So it was, in quotes, interpreting the affective behavior of another person within the context of environmental events and responding in accordance with the putative cause of the affective behaviors. Did you get all that? Catch that?
What?
Wow. I use my favorite word, putative.
Yes, I know.
I use that all the time.
I wanted to point that out too.
Look at my face, Diana. I'm holding this glass. I'm rubbing it. I'm sticking my face into, the computer, but it looks confused. So
your face
please
looks confused.
Describe a little more.
Right, exactly. So what they're saying here is that you need to be attending to the other person in the environment, using the environmental cues as well as their affect, right? So their overt presentation of emotion to interpret how they might be feeling and then responding in accordance with what they call the putative cause of their behavior. So putative means kind of like probable but not fully determined.
I love
we
it.
use that with, we say a preference assessment produces a putative reinforcer. We don't know for sure unless we do a reinforcer assessment. Kind of you're going on a hunch, right? Oh, this person seems sad. They might be sad for this reason, and then responding accordingly. So that boils down to being the basic definition of how we've been defining perspective taking, but they're calling it social perception. And they identify several subsets of sub-skills within that include observing someone else's affect, right? So how they're presenting emotionally, discriminating relevant environmental context in which they are presenting this affect, tacting public and private emotions of yourself and the other person that you're in this relationship with, and then differentially reinforcing the other's affective behavior. So, like I said, we've really jumped forward here into looking at a much more complex scenario in which you have someone who's presenting a certain behavioral pattern and you're attempting to respond accordingly, whether they're feeling happy or sad or mad or whatever it might be. So, as we've mentioned, like we've covered that there's a lot of different behavior analytic literature that's looked at some of the types of studies in between what Rob and Jackie talked about and what I've talked about here. So just as an example, there was a Gina et al. Study in 1996 that looked at discriminating and responding to the affect of adults, right? So if practicing, like the adult looks sad, you come over and say, what's wrong? If you pretend to hurt yourself and you say, ouch, and they say, do you need help or something like that? The one that we talked about in our empathy episode number 53, where they practiced the empathy responses with puppets. You guys remember the puppet episode, right?
Yeah.
That was Strauss 2009. And then Hood and colleagues more recently in 2017 looked at responding to nonverbal cues in the context of greetings and conversation skills. So this one most closely extends from the Hood et al. Study. So
and then we did one during Grab Bag, the college skills, which I think covered some of. I don't remember if it was exactly Hood at all, like extension, but it had that same idea of like, how do you respond? Like someone's looking at their watch. That's the cue of like, do you like other movie? Rather than keep talking about your preferred topic.
I forgot about that one, but that's a good one too. But the point that they're making in the context of this particular study is that, yes, we can teach these skills, but they are quite resource intensive. So if there was a way that we could perhaps teach them in a group format, that might be good. The current study did, I think, a whole series of these. And this article in particular is targeting some of the skills that they taught sort of in their second set of social skills that they were teaching to these students. But this was one that they wrote up as this study. So what they were looking to do here was evaluate the use of group video instruction to teach perspective taking / social perception skills. And they had previously taught, using the same video group instruction model, 6 skills that also would largely fall underneath the perspective taking / social perception repertoire, which included offering help, maintaining a conversation, asking social questions, showing items to others, commenting about activities, and complimenting peers. So those are all awesome skills that were targeted. But it's important to know that in the current study, there were 5 participants, and 4 of them, they'd all been through this social skills series, and 4 of them had mastered these 6 skills that I just mentioned. So that gives you a little bit of an idea on sort of the behavioral repertoire, social repertoire of these students, if you were thinking about how this might be applicable to clients that you work with, perhaps. So what they wanted to do here was do a multiple probe design in which they taught skills across 3 domains. They had 5 participants. All of them were teenagers who either had an autism diagnosis or an intellectual disabilities diagnosis. And 4 of them spoke in full sentences, but they weren't overly interested in engaging with their peers, or they had some difficulty in determining if their peers were interested in the conversation that they were having, right? So there was certainly work for all of them to be done there. They taught this during their regular school day. They had a social skills group that they attended in a suburban high school in the Midwest. That's all we know. So they had a class that was their social skills group where they practiced these skills. And then they used the cafeteria at lunchtime for the generalization probes. They did have that built in there as well.
Very brave to do any work in a high school cafeteria. I read that and said, oh, no, don't, please stop. No. So loud. How do you?
So loud. And in both the social skills groups and the generalization groups, they had peers without a diagnosis that were part of the study as well to help facilitate the interactions.
That's really helpful, I think.
Yeah. So they had an iPad to play the videos, and then there were also puzzles and card games for the activities. And then the participants in the study earned points for their participation, so they had like those materials available as well. The videos were really short. They had 13 different videos, and they were all less than 30 seconds, so those were made ahead of time. Most of them had one of the typically developing peers who was in the social skills group, was in the video for most of the videos as well, which likely sort of helped with some of that modeling. And then they did run the videos or the ideas of the videos by other high schoolers to ask if they thought that the skills that were targeted were socially important. So that's kind of good to know. So the 3 skills that they were looking at were extending conversations, joining conversations, and then responding to affective behavior. So how did the other person, look like they felt? And the first 2 skills, the other high schoolers felt were highly socially valid. So extending conversations and joining conversations. They were less sure about responding to affective behaviors, but the experimenters were like, well, we're going ahead with it anyway, which I think is totally fair. And I wonder if maybe how it was worded was confusing is kind of what I'm wondering, because it's highly socially valid that we respond to how one another is feeling, right? But it's something that's so sort of basic to our social interactions that maybe we don't think about its importance or recognize that it's something that we do regularly. So I'm wondering if there was like a little bit of a crossed wires there regarding what they were really asking the high schoolers, but I guess I don't fully know. But they went ahead, they forged ahead with their plan to teach that as well.
Fair.
Yeah, totally fair. So those were our 3 dependent variables, and then there were video scripts in which each of those skills was modeled, and then there were opportunities to practice them. So for the extending conversations, it looked like a peer would tell a participant something about a past or future plans, right? Like, I did something really fun last weekend. Pause, right? And what they were looking for from the participant was that they would orient their eyes to the peer, vocally acknowledge, like, oh, that's cool, and then ask a question to learn more. What did you do? Type thing. So that was the first skill, the one that they taught first. Next up was joining conversations. So here there were 2 to 3 peers in a conversation or playing a game, and the participant needed to first come over to the group, but stop like a meter away, which is like 3 feet away. Wait to speak until a peer made a vocal or non-vocal indicator, such as like scooching over. I love that word.
Scooch.
We always say scooch-a-booch, or patting the table spot next to them, or like like making the come on over motion with their hand.
Ooh,
not a come hither, just a come on. You know what I mean?
All fingers, not just one.
Exactly. Yes. All fingers. And then the participant needed to ask a general question like, hey, what are you guys talking about? Like that. So that's the second skill, joining a conversation. And then the last one, responding to affective behavior. the peer would exhibit a non-vocal indicator of their affect or emotion, and it was one of 5 emotions: happy, mad, sad, nervous, and confused. And the participant needed to orient their eyes to the peer, tact the affect, meaning they would say, like, you look mad, and then ask the peer a question or a comment such as, what's wrong? So those were the 3 things that they targeted. It could be argued that the first 2 are less perspective taking and more just social skills, right? But the third one for sure fits into the social skills realm. And if you're doing a good job of extending a conversation, then that could be part of perspective taking as well, right? Because you're like, oh, this person wants to talk about this thing. I should continue the conversation in order to, have this interaction with them. So the way the social skills group looked, they had 5 to 7 minutes where they reviewed the rules. Like I said, everyone could earn points for participating. And then at the end, they did a wrap up. Each group would have 2 to 3 peers and then one of the typically developing peers in the group. And depending on the skill that they were working on, they would have like 50 conversation starters available for the typically developing peer to start things off if they were going to work on extending a conversation. If they were going to work on joining the conversation, then there would be a game going. And then the target participant would be with the facilitator of the group, like the special education teacher. And they'd say, hey, why don't you go see what the group is doing? And then if it was affect, then the typically developing peer, they had a whole list of behaviors that they could engage in that were intended to indicate the particular emotion that they were supposed to be exhibiting, right? So like if they were nervous and maybe they said you could bite your lip or you could like fidget with your hands, you could like pace around a little bit, and they could pick which one they did. And then the facilitator would say, maybe you should go check on this person, right? So that was kind of how each of them was set up. In baseline, they were embedded within the context of the social skills group activity. There were either 2 or 5 opportunities. They had a little bit of a flub up there where they initially only offered 2 and they were like, oh shoot, they should have done more. So they were honest about that. I love it when that happens, quite honestly, because I'm like, look, this stuff happens all the time where you're like, oh shoot, that was not what we should have planned for. But anyway, it was not that big of a deal because in baseline, no one knew the skills yet. And they were able to demonstrate that pretty readily. They didn't give them any immediate feedback for the participants in baseline, as one should. But if they did perform the skill, then they would have received the natural social consequences. And then from the baseline, they moved to the video group instruction, which was just video modeling presented in a group format. Like that's all it was. The facilitator would say, we're going to work on extending conversations today. And then they'd show the video as a model, and then they would practice with the peer. That's what it was. That's what it looked like. They made sure that they each had one opportunity to practice after the video. If they did it, they received natural social consequences. If they didn't, there was an error correction where the facilitator would come over and have them practice it with them. And then for the one participant that hadn't mastered those previous skills that we talked about, he was also the one that didn't speak in full sentences. And this seemed like it was maybe a bit of a stretch for him. So for him, they gave him a textual prompt as well in order to sort of help him out in this part. And once the group was demonstrating the skill with the video, then they started a video fading procedure. And I liked this. I thought this was a good way to do it. So they gave everyone a chance to respond without the video. But if anyone needed the video, then the whole group watched the video. And then the next time they would do that again and again, right? So it was nice. Yeah. Didn't single anyone out, right? And it made it continue to be like a group presented format. And I hadn't seen it written that way before. So I thought that was quite helpful. So that was the video fading. And then once that was faded successfully, then they did a generalization test at lunchtime in the cafeteria, which is a pretty big test, right?
That's huge.
Yeah, I know.
It's the ultimate test.
Right.
So for all of the participants, the video group instruction and fading went great. Everyone learned under these conditions, with the exception of Sam, who's the one that I've been mentioning, who needed the textual prompts. He needed a little more assistance, even with the video group instruction. It was the responding to the affective behavior that was challenging for him. For everyone else, this video group instruction format seemed to work quite well. And then for the generalization, that was more variable, as you might imagine, right? Lunchtime in the cafeteria is quite a variable place to be anyway. So for Allison, she had a few instances of generalization in that context, but overall did not really occur. For Marissa, They saw generalization for extending and joining conversations, but not for responding to affective behavior. For Xavier, they only saw generalization in one instance. For Chad, they saw generalization for extending conversation and for responding to affective behavior, but not for joining in. And then for Sam, they did not see generalization in that context. But overall, those were quite good results, particularly considering the complex nature of the skills that they were trying to teach. I think that they got any generalization at all was really promising and exciting. And they were doing it with the peers. It wasn't like an experimenter-led generalization component, right? It was like pretty much the real deal. So I appreciated that a lot. They also did a social validity with the participants and asked them like how they thought it went and if they liked what was being presented. And for the most part, it was quite high.
Some did not.
Some
want to
didn't
take
really
that
love
class
it.
Again if they could avoid it.
But that's, they're high school, they're teenagers, right? You're like, no, yeah.
Fair, right? Like,
yeah, totally fair, I think. And then they did bring up some nice important points. I think that the social reinforcers are likely going to be idiosyncratic for individuals. Like all people, I think, value different social interaction differently and different types of social interaction. So the diagnosis does not preclude someone from liking social interaction, but also doesn't indicate whether they are going to like or dislike a certain type. And I think that that's important to take away, right? Like particularly, I have to look back now. Chad, I was like, Chad didn't want to, he could extend the conversation and he identified the affective behavior, but didn't want to join in the conversation. And to me, I'm like, well, maybe he's shy, like maybe that's just not something he's going to be that great at. I think I felt an affinity for him because I hate that scenario where you're like, oh, those people are talking together. Like I would never go up and just be like, hey guys, what are you doing? Like, that's just not me, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or like, I'm just going to go to the bathroom again. Like I just don't. Anyway, different people.
That's why you're friends with Rob and I.
That's right. I know.
Yeah.
I need people to bring me into those scenarios. And maybe Chad is like that too. And that's okay. You know what I mean? And then they felt that the generalization scenarios were pretty challenging. They got some variable results. And there's just so many variables present there that you don't really know what was controlling responding or what produced the failure in generalization. Mm-hmm. And then the other and last point that I will make is they bring up the point that the error correction procedure in the social skills group may have functioned as a punisher.
Right.
So some of the responding that they saw there really may have been avoidance responding away from receiving error correction. And that's why they didn't see the generalization to the cafeteria. Mm-hmm. So all in all, I think it was an excellent study and they did a lot of really good stuff.
They were thinking, right?
Yeah. So let's move into dissemination station and sort of sum up what we've learned and what we want to see going forward. Our train was very quiet today.
Oh no!
There we go. Oh, thank God. I almost got hit by the train. I couldn't hear. So the gist of these articles really relates to when you think about perspective taking as a multiple component behavior with varying levels of skills, both in development and in terms of actions, reactions to the environment or interactions to the environment, we have a number of interventions, which really just build on discrete trial training and video modeling methodologies in looking specifically at, well, what are the relevant cues and what are the relevant responses that we as individuals would engage in to be perspective takers. And it does seem that looking at kind of breaking down what those cues are and then specifically training them does result, at least in the controlled environment, in pretty strong results. We also have a sense that the closer the training setting is to the generalization or the real world setting, the better the odds you'll see at least some amount of generalization of the skill. I think one of the challenges we run into here is that we've only got one article that looked specifically at kind of the terminal goal of perspective taking and how it relates to our social interactions. The first two articles really talked about specific skills that we assume, we believe will lead to that long-term perspective taking skill, but we don't know for sure. It's just sort of like I can train someone to engage appropriately in the Sally Ann task, and then what? Does that actually then result in a better life for that individual? Or did I just teach them to do a specific test that you see in a psychology or cognitive psychology textbook? And that, I think we're still not 100% sure. I also wonder if some of these later video modeling skills if we might have seen even better generalization had they been done with a slightly younger group. Because I think one of the issues that runs in, and I felt there was our participant who was like, one of the reasons they ended up in this group, they didn't like engaging in social interaction. And part of it is that, like you were saying, Dada, well, some people just don't like engaging in social interaction. But then you always have to say, but is it they don't like engaging in social interaction because it has been such a punishing event for so long in their life that they just, no, thank you. I won't put any response effort into this. It's such a bad experience. And if we worked with younger individuals who didn't have any sort of error history with social interactions, would they be more into the treatment and be more likely to then demonstrate generalization? Because there's still reinforcement to be had in a social interaction, whereas it might just be a cue for punishment for older students who just had such a tough time of it before. So I would be curious to see, do we get better generalization with younger students or with participants who are so gung-ho about, I'm so interested in social interaction. So, we kind of took someone who like, no, I want this to be my goal. Would we see better results? So I'd be curious to see that.
I'd be curious to see if they ran the 2019 study with the 2011 participants, right? So maybe we need to have maybe this isn't just we do it in the natural environment. Maybe we start off tabletop, then we move to the natural environment, and then, we vary the natural environment to what we see and build upon each of those skills. I mean, it's going to be a long time, right? But for, our clients that don't have any of these skills, we need to work our way up to Diana's article, right? So I think that would be a huge dissertation. Well, so needed, I think, to have like a step-by-step analysis of all of the skills that are necessary for perspective taking and how you teach them. That would be cool. That's what I'm looking for.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really such a broad area and what could fall underneath the category of perspective taking that it would end up amassing a lot of the different things that we teach as social skills, right? A lot of them could be sort of reinterpreted or housed underneath the area of perspective taking. So it may depend just on how broadly we want to make that definition. And then to me, the overall question is like, how do we really use perspective taking as, presumably socially functioning adults in our lives, right? And which are the components that are most functional? And how can we arrive at the demonstration of those skills in a functional manner? Because I think that there are many ways that one could teach it to get there. And there may be some ways to teach it that are more effective and more parsimonious than the laborious process of trying to teach the Sally-Ann test, which is really, really hard to do if you've ever tried to do it. And I just wonder, like, what exactly are the steps that are requisite there? Because with typically developing kids, they don't have it, and then suddenly they do have it, right? And what exactly is the process by which that occurs? Because it's still learning, right? It's just something that I don't think we still have a super great handle on.
Yeah, I agree.
Whenever I see instances of perspective taking in children's like TV programming, I've always wanted to note it and like make a running list so I could sort of take a look at those and see if those types of scenarios are ones in which kids are actually learning from, right? Like in Frozen, and spoiler alert here for anyone, stop the tape if you haven't seen Frozen, but there at the end, there's a point in time in which some of the characters know that Hans is a bad guy and some of them do not, right?
True.
And it's important to understand who knows that he's a bad guy in order to understand the plot of the movie and what's going on, and how you interpret the feelings of the other characters are going to depend on what they know. And that's really complex, right? And there is a point at which kids start to understand that and could then be able to tack that for themselves, and their understanding of the movie as a whole changes. And we expect that from relatively young kids. But do those types of situations illustrate and progress children's understanding of perspective taking is a question that I would be interested in answering.
Or is it just pretty? And they're like, ooh, it's pretty, a song, right?
Initially, yes. But then at some point, they do start to understand this.
Right.
And then I think the ultimate test is if they watch the TV show Lost from the 2000s, are they able to keep track of all the mysteries and which islander knows what's secret about this special place? Can they appreciate it as much as we all do? I know you all out there think fondly of Lost and loved that last episode.
Rob, that island just has so many secrets.
So many. Smoke monster. What's up with that? Oh, there we'll do a Lost rewatch with you, Jackie.
Thank you.
All right. There's so much more to say about perspective taking, but I won't say it right now.
Well, we talked about 2.5 components of, or actually 1.5 components of perspective taking, of the various pieces that lead to the final goal of perspective taking. So yes, there's a lot more that could go into it. Some of it, just the research isn't there. Some of it we just didn't have time to go over. But I do think, some of the strengths of these articles is they at least lend themselves to something that is, I think, easily replicated. So you don't know if these are going to lead to the goals for students or your clients that we're all looking for. However, these aren't particularly harmful or difficult treatment packages if you did want to try them out and then, see what the results were. It's in the research and it's pretty straightforward in terms of how to replicate. You need to get a lot of stimuli though to do some of these. All right. Well, I think that brings us to the end of our episode on perspective taking. I had a lot of fun. Is a topic that I hadn't looked too much into myself. So it was really nice to get some new information. I hope it was for all of you out there. So while we come to the end.
I had fun too.
Oh, good. I'm glad you had fun. Before we come to the end of the show, I want to make sure everyone gets that second secret code word, and it is syrup. Or some of you might say syrup.
That's how I say it.
I say syrup.
I say syrup. Because I'm very fancy. SYRUP, syrup. It's the viscous material that you put on pancakes and waffles. Or
that
muffins.
Comes out of trees.
Comes out of tree. Well, that's maple syrup. You could have a different syrup, I guess.
Syrup.
Chocolate syrup, yeah.
Chocolate syrup also comes out of trees.
Syrup.
Chocolate trees.
It comes out of the fruit. It doesn't come out of the tree itself. Oh, man. You're just making me think of how we missed maple days at our old Sturbridge Village near our house. Oh, so sad. All right. Well, in any case, we want to say a big thank you to all of our listeners out there. We hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, please let us know by leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, wherever you like to download your podcast. Please feel free to reach out to us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Pinterest as ABA Inside Track. You can find these episodes also posted on YouTube with the YouTube subtitling feature enabled. And also go to the website, abainsidetrack.com, if you'd like to get links to the articles that we discussed, or if you would like to get CEUs, listening to CEUs. And finally, you can always just shoot us an email, abainsidetrack@gmail.com. Big thank you to Dr. Jim Carr for recording our intro and outro music, to Kyle Sturry for our interstitials. Big thank you to Dan Thabit of the Podcast Doctors. I think this is the first episode we've recorded since he did an amazing turnaround editing job. We had to get 2 episodes out 2 weeks in a row, and he was able to get everything out right on time. No problems at all. I think I was the slowest in terms of actually getting the website updated. So thanks very much to Dan, and then also to Hollis Irvin from Sycamore Workshop for his visual designs. Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Diana. Of course, don't want to forget that. We'll be back next week with another full-length episode, but until then, keep responding. Bye! Bye!